sometime in 2024, I made a video where I followed a single dwarf in Dwarf Fortress for 10 in-game years. That video centered around a dwarf named Cog. Cog was a relatively normal dwarf, with a bit of a tragic backstory, and over that span of 10 years we watched as his mood shifted, and he became a very different kind of person, harboring a lot of anger from his tragic past, until he eventually finds love, and even learned to resurrect those who had left the lands of the living. This is a similar video, but with a twist. The dwarf that I will be following this time has a very peculiar ailment. You see, they're a vampire, but that wasn't always the case. I made them this way. This is the story of me following a single dwarf for 10 years, from the day that they became a vampire, cursed to prowl the night in search of blood, stalking the halls of my fortress, and craving the warm blood of living flesh. How will their mind change and contort over these 10 years? And how did I even bestow this curse upon them? Welcome to After Casket, and the tales of a dwarven vampire. And in order to properly tell this tale, we have to step back a little bit and take a look at the bigger picture. Our story takes place in a collection of lands known as the Infinite Universes. While the world is largely uninhabited, leaving much space for wildlife to roam free, there are collections of society. One of those spaces is the Dipped Volcano, a dwarven civilization. Peace has been a rare thing amongst these peoples, because since the founding of the faction, they have actively been at war with the Hill of Monasteries, an elven civilization. Many fights have taken place over the years, and many dwarven lives have been lost. But it isn't just the elves. The humans of the Union of Butter have been causing much disturbance on the perimeter of the dwarven faction, sending small raiding parties to steal from the dwarven hillixes, which provide the majority of the food supply for the dwarven factions. And if that wasn't enough, every now and again there is a small fight with the goblins, adding even more casualties to the pile. And with all of the violence surrounding the dwarves, it would make sense that they have begun to develop a bit of a grim culture. The clearest manifestation of this phenomenon is in their most worshipped deity, the deity of Ureth, taking the form of a skeletal male dwarf, representing war and death, closely followed by Duthal, the deity of healing. And no one will ever forget the deity of Nagarak, of torture, misery, lightning, thunder, and the rain. The dwarves of the Dipped Volcano are a tortured crew, but resilient, which is why they've taken up residence in the steepest hills they can find, attempting to locate the most defendable locations, hoping to build places to live that are impenetrable from the prying eyes of those damned elves. And that is why 7 dwarves founded After Casket, an intended military outpost on the side of a sheer cliff face, located along the perimeter of a dwarven highway. As the fortress established, it was quickly made clear that this wasn't a fortress for leisure, but instead a fortress for a religious vision to the god of Urak. But as with all gods, different denominations and religious groups follow with different levels of severity. The most extreme of which is the Communion of Gods, which is by far the largest group of worshippers of the god of death, preaching nothing but destruction of their enemies, and welcoming war with spear in hand, as if there was no other goal in life. It would not take long for the first petition to arrive at the fortress requesting a temple to the god of Urak on behalf of the Communion of Gods. This request was sent forward by none other than Tosid Guiltmonk. He is by far the most ardent worshipper of the god, hoping that he himself could bring death to everyone in the fortress, and war to the enemies abroad. But who is Tosid Guiltmonk, and what made him this way? And that's where I come in, the narrator. My goal in a fortress like this is to make the characters seem as interesting as possible, and dig out as many small little details about their personalities as I can. When myself and my 2 chat rooms founded the Fortress of After Casket, we had one specific goal: build a cool fortress and find a dwarf that would fit as a vampire. I already knew that the world was going to be kind of grim, due to its focus on evil gods, specifically Ureth and the Communion of Gods. After that, all I had to do was spot a dwarf who seemed like they would fit. And Tosid stood out to me, for a few reasons. First off, he was an ardent worshipper of Ureth, and he would be fitting as a religious leader, which automatically makes him a notable figure in the fortress. He has little interest in joking around, but rarely feels discouraged, and he is not particularly interested in what others think of him. But he can handle stress, and prefers that everyone lives as harmoniously as possible. Of course, his road or the high road. On top of that, his traits state that he's gregarious, has a good social awareness, hates hard work, and has a developed sense of empathy, and is humorless. A very serious dwarf. Now, the whole pitch of this video is I'm going to follow him for 10 years, but in order to complete that and get that goal rolling, I need a fortress that functions. And the first thing I'm required to do, after he arrived in the fortress anyways, was build a temple, because that's something that he needed, and something that he requested. At least, my head's telling me that. And of course, then I proceeded with what any respectable dwarf fortress overseer, or video narrator would do. I told them to build a temple. I found a spot just north of the entrance of the fortress that seemed fitting, cut out a shape that seemed large enough for a properly appointed temple, put some flooring down in a nice pattern, and then I waited. Once the floors were ready to go, I was curious to see just how many dwarves in the fortress, out of the 21 total, were a member of the Communion of Gods, and to my astonishment, it was 15. 15 dwarves out of 21 dwarves are all part of the same religion and worship the same god. This is a really high number, even for me. I'm not even exaggerating here. This is a lot of dwarves worshiping the same religion and the same god simultaneously. They must really like war and death. Looking at myself here, I think that these images are a little bit out of date for this video. I think I should enter my villain era. Hold on. I need to power up. That's much better. Now I feel properly villainous. We shall continue. Moving forward, I assigned a bard as a performer. For this, I selected Shorast, who seemed to have decent enough skills. Perhaps she could be some sort of protege or heir after Tosid moves up in the ranks. Because at the moment, Tosid was a bit busy helping sort marble out of the rest of the stone that we'd discovered. You see, there was a lot of flux. Just in case I wanted to start making steel in the fortress, I needed that to be sorted out correctly. And it wouldn't take long for the temple to be considered finished, and I was then able to appoint Tosid as the sacred slaughter of the Communion of Gods, which, I do have to note, is one hell of a title for any dwarf, let alone one leading a religion for the god of death. Before Tosid had arrived in the fortress, one of my dwarves had created a hematite scepter, which I used as a central piece in this particular temple. Now, as I was building the fortress, I was plotting in the back of my mind. I needed to turn Tosid into a vampire, and that was going to prove rather difficult and a bit cumbersome and tedious, but I was very unknowing of that fact at this point. I was focused on building the fortress, and it progressed quite quickly, and rather smoothly considering how many wars were going on in the overworld. I built out bedrooms, got a pretty stable farming setup up and running down in the cavern layers, and pastured all of our animals down there with it. I expanded and built an area that would later be used as a prison for our sheriff and eventually captain of the guard. Many dwarves were claimed by the Twitch chat and YouTube chats, who of course have their own personalities and lives of their own. And hopefully most of them worship the death god, so they won't be too upset when they get, deathed. And Tosid seems to be liking his new job. I mean, he's quite satisfied at work most of the time. He is spending a lot of that time making crafts and blocks in the fortress, as well as simply putting stuff away, and then getting yelled at by the occasional upset citizen. One of the first social spaces I built in the fortress was an engraver's guild, so he's learning a little bit of engraving as well. One problem with Tosid, that may prove to be a strain on him in the future, is he dreams of raising a family, but is lonely after being away from them. We don't know too much about his past. His parents disappeared a long time ago, and that may prove to be a problem in the future. But only time will tell, because more migrants were arriving in Aftercasket, bringing the population up to about 37, and with them, additional religions, worshipping more fringe gods. We'll have to keep a close eye on them. Some of them even worship this fish thing. Thankfully, the overall population of worshippers of the Communion of Gods has risen to 22. And all of the activity in the fortress must have brought the awareness of the mountain home, because the first round of traders also arrived that year, and we sold them all of the stone rings that we had been crafting, and they accepted them graciously. But as far as I was concerned, as the population was rising, now up to 45, we had some problems that we needed to fix in this fortress as soon as possible, and one of those was raising the walls down in the cavern layers, because creatures could quite possibly climb directly into the fortress. We couldn't be having any of that. And as the population climbed, so did the number of guilds in the fortress, so I added in a few additional guilds to satisfy the newcomers. And eventually, as is to be expected, a request came in from Tosid Guiltmonk himself once more. The Communion of Gods now requires a temple complex and a high priest. Tosid was going to receive his religious promotion after all. The Pope of War and Death, or maybe a cardinal perhaps, as there's still one rank higher. And Shorast would get her promotion as well, moving her up to the position of the Sacred Slaughter, and Tosid to the position of Exalted Blade. I could scarcely believe the good news, to the point where I thought I would get to know Shorast a little bit. It turns out she likes to present herself boldly, even if it would offend the average sense of modesty. She lived an orderly life, organized and neat, and does not easily hate or develop negative feelings, and tends to be a bit tight with resources when working on projects. She is open to changing her mind, and she is often nervous. She does not have a great aesthetic sensitivity, and is conflicted by this as she values artwork and its creation, and she tends to hang on to grievances. She generally finds herself to be quite hopeful about the future, and doesn't focus on material goods. She does not easily fall in love, and rarely develops positive sentiments, and doesn't mind a little tumult and discord in day-to-day living, but is quite comfortable with others that have a different appearance or culture. She seems like a good assistant, honestly. Good to know you. Shorast Boatring. And as the construction was completed, I've polished off the last few steps needed to secure the caverns, and then decided to open up the gates to allow the dwarves to bring in the last of the wood that I'd left outside. And the fortress was starting to attract some attention. The population had risen all the way up to 73. It was early autumn in the year 214, and we were starting to see our first few visitors. There were some human merchants scattered about the tavern, as well as some dancers. And they seemed mighty well armed for dancers, but I'm sure this was nothing out of the ordinary. I'm sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was suspicious about these visitors. And in fact, nothing notable happened, and nobody misbehaved. It wouldn't be until Gili entered the fortress, with a peculiar item in their inventory. A steel battle axe. All craftsmanship is of the highest quality, and decorated with maple. You see, this battle axe was stolen from the dwarves about 100 years ago, and never returned. Tosid quickly gave the order to the mayor. We must acquire this battle axe. And since I'm in my villain era, I agreed, and ordered my squads stab him to death. And after a matter of seconds, there would be a hole the size and shape of a spearhead, driven directly through his brain. The dwarves cheered in victory, and some of them winced in fear and pain and disgust at the corpse. And the soldiers went back to training, and I chucked his corpse in the corpse pile, along with the other mortal enemies that have attacked the fortress. Mostly the Sunny Badger. Terrifying. We almost lost that battle. Hopefully there isn't more of them. But the battle axe was ours, and Tosid was pleased. And so, I thought it was time for Tosid to be visited by a messenger from his god, as the fortress grew from nothing to a writhing metropolis of 73 dwarves. Tosid had been waiting quietly for his opportunity to take over the fortress and make it his, because those who worship the communion of gods shall be the strongest they'd ever been within the walls of Aftercasket. And as he preached the word of the god of death, it is said that Yrith heard him, and that's what set this whole thing in motion. Now, you're probably wondering exactly how did I do this? Well, evil mode engaged, it was quite simple. I simply retired the fortress. And you might be thinking, what? Why would you do a thing like that? Well, simply put, retiring the fortress gives me access to adventure mode. So I loaded a new game in the same existing world, and selected the infinite universes. Once I see this menu where I can select the one of 3 modes, I selected adventurer mode. And after the calendar moves forward by a couple of days, which is about a minute of in-game time in fortress mode, I built my party. To be pretty blunt, I was very simple about it. I made 2 adventurers. The first of which was a dwarf, who wielded an axe, and then also a goblin, for some evil effect. I made sure that they were both members of the Dipped Volcano and worshippers of the god of Ureth. The faction that you select in adventure mode mostly just gives you places to start your adventure. Any fortress that's owned by that faction is a place where you can begin. I selected somewhere that was relatively close to the Fortress of Aftercasket, and with that we were off. And we immediately appeared in a space that I quite expected to see. A small square box, slightly underground, surrounded by random peasants, in a surface settlement known as a dwarven hillocks. Some people think that all dwarves live underground, but this is absolutely not the case. Hillockses are kind of the equivalent of hobbit holes, surrounded by farmlands. They're quite pleasant, really, and generally located around the perimeters of the dwarven mountain homes, which are mostly underground. After exiting the little smelly hole, I walked outside and my goblin gave us a sermon. I was curious about how they would respond to hearing the word of their god preached. They both seemed to enjoy it. Oh, and silly me, I almost forgot. The dwarf's name is Stinthad, quest god, and the goblin's name is Yura Abbey Music. Both considered prophets in their own right, but skilled enough to be able to survive in the wilds. After that brief diversion, I moved into fast travel and ran directly towards the nearest temple. Temples sometimes have dice, and these dice can be rolled with a chance to get cursed by your god. However, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any fully completed temples, or any dice to speak of, so I quickly gave up and decided to go with plan B, stare at the cool volcano on the surface, and contemplate my decisions. Naturally, yelling at the volcano didn't do anything of note or value, so I then went back into fast travel mode and went to another hillocks to look for small shrines around the edges of the hillocks. I also didn't find anything of note, so we yelled at the people in the nearest large space and gave them a sermon, and I think they enjoyed that. After that, I went to plan C, which is travel to the nearest dwarven fortress, which I did, and then ran around it in circles for a bit until I finally found the entrance. Once I spotted the entrance, we walked inside and ran down the very spirally ramp case. It's not really a staircase, it's more of a ramp case. Until I found one of these. These are dice. In a shrine to the god of Ureth, which is exactly what I wanted. I then swapped characters over to my little goblin and picked up the dice and rolled it. And thankfully, we got a blessing of a week's good fortune, which normally I think gives you an XP boost, but I don't care so much, so I simply saved and continued playing. Then I rolled the dice again and got a warning. And then I rolled the dice again and got yelled at. It's like plugging the internet in at 2 a.m. when your parents have told you that no, you can't go on the internet because you'll be up all night. And then, of course, you proceed to play Halo Combat Evolved Custom Edition until 4 o'clock in the morning when your dad wakes up and scolds you. Yeah, it's just like that. Definitely a fictitious story that I didn't make up. And Dad, no, I never actually did that. You're definitely not watching this video anyways, so it doesn't matter, right? Right? Anyways, after the god was done yelling at me, he informs us that we have been cursed to assume the form of a antelope-like creature every full moon. And while everybody with an antelope persona is partying, I am displeased with this, so I immediately quit without saving and then reload the save. Because I had just saved, that's why I did that. Definitely. And then proceed to pick up the dice and roll it again. This time, we got yelled at, as to be expected. But we were cursed to prowl the night in search of blood. Now we have a singular vampire, who is a goblin. It's good to have you, Abbey Music. Now, we gotta do the same thing with the dwarf. So I save, as one does, and my dwarf grabs the dice and rolls it. And I get cursed with a week of bad luck. Oh no! Anyways, I roll the dice again. And I'm informed not to tempt fate, so a little bit miffed, I roll the dice again. And the god yells at me once more. Sorry, Dad. Hubris! He screams. And thus, both of my adventurers have been forced to prowl the night in search of blood, which is very good, so I save the game. With this task complete, we run back to the surface, and I realize that there is a very violent brawl going on in this pit over here. Normally, I would try and investigate, but I think it's best that we just move on. That blood's a little bit too tempting for us now. And so we continue on our journey. But I have a task that I need to complete, which is pretty straightforward when you think about it. I need to get some blood out of one of my 2 adventurers. That's why I have 2. It's kind of like an insurance policy, so I do the most normal thing that anybody would do in a case like this. Go find some cultists and try to beat them up. However, I did kind of expect this to happen, but not so quickly. You see, Abbey Music wasn't as skilled in combat as our dwarf Sninthad was, so he kind of got shredded like immediately by the cultist. It truly was a shame. And perhaps I was a bit enthusiastic. I didn't really expect the blind cave bears, and our horse kind of got spooked and didn't do much of value. But thankfully, I was able to fill up a container with the blood of the goblin. And after beating the crap out of everything else in the room until it all kind of fell over and stopped breathing, I said a short prayer to the god of death, holy be his power, and the foreheads of my foes, and then I picked up my dead goblin friendo. I figured it would be fitting to go back to the cool volcano while watching my horse murder every single walking thing out in the wild, although this honey badger probably deserved it, and throw his corpse into the lava. See ya, little buddy. We had a good life. I'm sure you did too. At least, what short time there was for you. After that, I proceeded to run to the fortress, with my container of blood in hand. Now, previously, in my videos, I released a video where I built a fortress of vampires, and I used a well for that. It was a little bit tedious and convoluted, but similar science to what I'm doing here. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this took a few tries for me to get right, which is why there's blood and water everywhere. Essentially, what I had to do was I needed a container of water and a container of vampire-infected blood. Then I poured the water on the ground. Then I poured the blood into the same tile with the water on the ground. And then I filled one of the two containers back up with the water on the ground, which had then been laced with goblin blood. This won't work if you do this in any other order. And trust me, I had to reload a couple times to make this right. Once completed, I then ran to the tavern until I found Tosid. I then offered to give them a gift. And in this little trading menu, I gave Tosid the container, which in this case was a flask, filled with water, laced with blood. Upon doing so, I ran as far away from the fortress as possible, or at least as far as I was willing to run. Spoilers, not very far, just a town or two over. And I retired the adventurer. Once that was completed, I then loaded a new fort in an existing world and clicked on the reclaim option, and reclaimed After Casket. When I reclaimed the fortress, Tosid was in his bedroom, and the flask was on the floor, so I locked the door. Then what I did was put him in the military, because he would automatically equip a flask and use it as a beverage source. He then hung around in his room for a little bit, until he took a sip. Once he took a sip, the timer starts, and it's time to follow a vampire for the next 10 years. Starting in late fall, in the year 214. Naturally, this will end in late fall 224. Roll the title card, because Tosid, the Exalted Blade of the Communion of Gods villain era, awaits. And with that, it's time to lay down the ground rules. In order to beat this challenge run, I need to follow Tosid for the next 10 years. But there are some restrictions on what I can do. I can only pause the game on the 5s and 0s of every month, meaning I could pause on the 5th or the 10th, but not the 13th. But the 15th, I can pause. And just for my sanity, I also allow myself to pause the game on the 1st of every month. While the game is paused, I can complete tasks and work on the fortress. But the rest of the time, I have to be following Tosid, regardless of what happens. Ideally, this will lead to some amusing interactions and crazy problems in the future, but let's see how it plays out. Tosid seems to be in a bit of a bad mood. Unfortunately, he just had his last night's sleep, so that's no longer going to be a benefit for him. You see, vampires live forever, they're immortal, and they don't need to sleep. They also don't need to eat or drink. Unless somebody is serving beverages, then they will happily accept one. So we will have to make sure that I have tavern keepers and performers in every single area where they can operate. We'll also need to provide lots of mugs and goblets for them to be able to serve beverages. Currently, Tosid's life is pretty straightforward. He meditates, gives sermons, and gets yelled at by unhappy citizens. Those are the main tasks of every religious leader in Dwarf Fortress. But he also has several other needs. As you can see, he needs a good meal. Well, he's never going to get that again. He wants to be with family, be with friends, and he needs martial training. We'll have to put him in the military at some point. But first, before I let him out of his room, I have to forbid this. I don't want anybody accidentally taking a sip of the vampire blood. You see, there's still 1 or 2 more charges in that, and I wouldn't want anybody else getting infected. That could get bad quick. Tosid does the logical thing and immediately runs off to the tavern to go do some socializing, since he's been locked in his room for the past couple of weeks. And I take the first opportunity on the 1st of Moonstone to work on some bedrooms, because the last thing that we need is Tosid getting a little thirsty as a vampire and sucking somebody dry in the middle of a public space. Then he'll get convicted of a bunch of crimes and probably go to prison, and that would be very boring. So I have to make sure that our bedrooms are up to date and properly set up, so that if he does get hungry, he has a little bit of privacy to do his feasting. Thankfully, Tosid seems to appreciate the fine arts. He is quite happy after watching all of these performances in the tavern. I assume the well-armed bards put on quite the show. After that, he quickly makes his way to the crafter's rooms and starts making some clothing, which is his learned trade. After all, he is a master clother. He's also a rusty but proficient cheesemaker, and has learned quite the skill in engraving since he's spent quite a lot of time in the Engravers Guild Hall. Making that public right at the start of the fort was definitely the right decision. It seems to be this is going to be his route for the next little bit. Pray for a bit, socialize for a little bit, and then go make some pants. Although he seems to be changing up the cycle by using a wheelbarrow and transporting some boulders into the fortress. Best pause now that it's the 5th and continue my work on the bedrooms. Tosid is bound to get a bloodlust sooner than later. I'm actually quite surprised. Normally new vampires immediately beeline towards the nearest sleeping dwarf and bite their neck. But Tosid seems to be taking his time. But I can't get complacent, so best keep working. Tosid's even helping set up the additional guild halls. What a hard-working dwarf. Bringing those gold statues that were recently forged. Absolutely glorious, with images of Urith, nonetheless. He seems to be quite satisfied with his work as well. Aside from the lack of alcohol, I really need to get those tavern keepers functioning fully. I thought I already had some. Maybe I just need more mugs. If there's no mugs kept in the tavern, then the tavern keepers can't serve alcohol, so Best work on that. He also seems to be a bit resentful after getting into arguments. He is claiming that the quest for knowledge never ends. Perhaps somebody disagrees. On the bright side, though, finishing up work is a consistent positive thought for him. Because he doesn't have a bedroom that he will be able to sleep in anymore, and he no longer has access to some of the general pleasantries that dwarves are accustomed to, it's going to be harder than normal to keep him happy. He's already falling down the happiness lines. He's currently the second to least happy dwarf in the fort. We're gonna have to compensate for this somehow. He also seems to be focusing on his masonry skill, working on blocks with the other dwarves. You can always rely on your family when everything else falls away, he says. Well, it's a shame that you have no family. Hate to break it to you, bud, but you're on your own on this one. Perhaps he's talking about the piles of puppies. Maybe that's his family. And I don't know what's going on just north of us, but that cannot possibly be good. Suddenly, Tosid becomes vengeful after entering an existing conflict, meaning something is fighting something somewhere. And I'm sure, oh, that's definitely it. Well, we found the problem. A bunch of troglodytes seem to have piled into the fortress, and the dwarves seem to have beaten them to death. Well, thankfully, they're just unalived troglodytes now. I'm sure there are some live ones that will come up later, and we'll kill them when we encounter them. But for Tosid, it just seems to be a bit of a distraction, and a source of stress, so he runs to his bedroom, seemingly to sleep. Sorry, mate, I got bad news for you. You can't sleep. Well, he seems to figure that out, and then he heads back down into the fortress. This is something that I've noticed, having watched all of this footage already on the stream, is he tends to cycle into his bedroom and then walks away and does nothing. It's like he's acting like he's going to go to sleep, trying to act normal. I don't know if this is intended behavior for vampires, but if it is, it's really interesting. After witnessing the dead troglodytes once more, he cycles back into his temple and goes back to praying. And I set up a bunch of places for drinks that can be brought in from the tavern. Dwarves need whiskey to get through that sermon, after all. And honestly, they must have put something really good into Tosid's whiskey that day, because he immediately goes into a strange mood. He's going to make an artifact. Hopefully it's something good. His last two thoughts were positive, feeling empathy and enraptured. Performing the rites of the communion of gods at a dedicated temple is a rite of passage for any religious dwarf. And just like that, he's off. And he claims a clother's shop and begins gathering his materials, thinking about the engravings that he learned recently, and he has some thoughts as he runs about being particularly secretive. When all other bonds wither, friendship will remain. I think he's trying to tell me something. He wants some friends. Same, Tosid. Same. Now, unfortunately, he immediately grinds to a halt. He's gathered everything he can up until this point, and he's asking for what appears to be some sort of glass. Well, if you insist, dwarf. So I put together a glass furnace and make some raw green glass after collecting some sand. And that seems to do the trick. Once he's collected his raw green glass, he gets back to work collecting ingredients for his artifact. And that seems to be pretty much it. Some cloth, some glass, some bones, and some wood. A nice simple artifact. And Tosid, Guilt Monk, the Exalted Blade Vampire, has created Ograd Zonus, a sleek llama wool right glove, and offers it to the mountainous vale. I think that shall be placed in his temple, somewhere to be admired by all the other dwarves, jealous of such an artifact, and he will watch it with a watchful eye, making sure those well-armed bards don't make off with it. With that whole ordeal out of the way, and being flung into a strange mood and all, I think that it put him under some sort of stress, because he walks off into the bedrooms. Why would he ever need to go back there? It's not like he needs to sleep. Maybe there's some unclaimed clothing. Oh, it appears that he finally got thirsty. Poor old Olin. Why did you have to die so scary-like? You've gone and scared the vampire. Tosid is gonna remember this for a long time. He's gonna have nightmares, most likely. It's gonna give him visions of the future and post-traumatic stress disorder. We can't have any scary deaths. Die pleasantly, please. No, of course, Tosid, being the good dwarf that he is, runs off to find the captain of the guard. Sort of the sheriff of this place. To inform them that somebody's been murdered. There's a vampire in the fortress, and this is terrifying. And sure enough, Olin has been found completely drained of blood. With that terrifying ordeal out of the way, I figured Tosid needed some respite, so I had pointed him to a military squad and let him go do some martial arts training with the other dwarves that were currently working at such things. He went and grabbed an axe, which I think was quite fitting, because times in the fortress are stressful. There's a vampire in our midst. Whatever shall we do? Since arriving in the fortress in the year 212, Tosid has had several happy events that he's been remembering, and thinking about quite a bit. Meaning no matter how bad things get right now, even though he is currently the most pissed off dwarf in the fortress, he can probably bounce back, because all of these memories are things that will pop up again and again and again in his thoughts. And hopefully he focuses on the positives, rather than the, well, scary death. We need happy deaths. Here at Dwarves, happy deaths. Speaking of happy deaths, Because Tosid is in charge of the religion of death, I figured that he should be the only one to bury the bodies, in a sort of clean up your own mess kind of way. But also, it makes sense that the religious leaders of the god of war and death would also be in charge of the catacombs, and the undertakers, if you will. So I removed the children from having to bury bodies, and make it a specific task for only Tosid, and his second-in-command, Shorast, Boatring. After he gets a little bit of exercise training with the military, I release him from his squad, and he beelines it back to his temple to continue meditating, as one does. He does seem to be happy about training the combat drills, and he recently spoke with an acquaintance. Well, it's good to see that he's making some friends. Unfortunately, he is reliving seeing Olin die. God damn it, Olin! Die peacefully, will you? I suppose now that it's the 15th and I can pause, I should get some tombs set up. That'll keep the rest of the dwarves busy for a little while. I've also sent Tosid on a new hobby. He's off to go milk some animals. Better the animals than the dwarves, I say. Out front on the fortress, I'm working on a little bit of excavation, as well as this little bridge thing, which is going to connect to the little mountain up to the north. Should make for a nice front door in the future. Tosid's down in the tavern telling stories, hopefully not about his drinking habits. In fact, it's much more innocent. He's talking about how Fath became the most exalted authority of the Communion of Gods. That is the one rank that is higher than Exalted Blade. I do personally feel that Exalted Blade sounds cooler, but that is quite literally a tale of the ancient dwarf pope. After telling his tales, he gets back to work and goes and places Olan's scary death into the tomb. Fortunately, he seems to be getting a little bit more used to seeing the bodies. He's not so upset this time, and then goes back to the tavern and continues chanting, singing, babbling, hopefully drinking, and then kind of wanders around the fortress for a little bit. Pretty aimlessly, actually. Good news is, he did, in fact, acquire some, I was gonna say alcohol because he's been euphoric due to inebriation, but, did you have to go so quick? Poor Stukos. There we have it again, with another scary death. This time he's sad, too. Man, that's like a double negative. And no, that does not equal a positive. It's like a negative and then a more negative. Well, there he goes again, off to report the crime. Someone's gonna have to take the fall for this, or people are gonna start getting suspicious. And it really doesn't help that he then immediately runs back to grab the body and bury it. It's like, dwarf goes into their bedroom to sleep, then another dwarf follows them in, comes running out and saying, "Oh no, they're dead!" and then goes back and carries the body away and throws them in the morgue. It's just kind of a funny series of events, I gotta be honest. When all other bonds wither, only friendship will remain, he says once again. Friendship with the dead, maybe. Here's hoping you don't start eating your friends. That would be unpleasant. Or maybe it's foreshadowing. Anyways, Tosid is horrified once again, seeing Stukos die. I do hope he gets over this sooner than later, cause he's still the most upset dwarf in the fort. We're gonna have to figure out a solution, but I have much more important things to tend to. You see, down in the cavern lair, I want to start making some dimple dye out of dimple cups, which is a type of mushroom, but that requires millstones to be powered. So I'm setting up some water wheels using this water supply over here to the right. It's also going to supply a well with some water. And shockingly, that this hasn't happened already, Tiny Haj has been elected to mayor, who was previously the chief medical dwarf. Long live the mayor, I suppose. It would be a shame if something were to happen to him. That wasn't the mayor. And Tosid didn't eat the mayor. So who killed this person? And who killed the mayor? Because there's now suddenly a new mayor? That may very well be the shortest term in office I've ever seen in Dwarf Fortress. What happened? Oh god. Why is there another vampire? Oh, wait a second. I know you. I've seen you before. That's not even your real name. You are lying there, madam. If it doesn't seem familiar to you, let me explain. When I retired my adventurer, I went 2 towns over, maybe about half a day's travel, and it seems that she's returned. She's assumed a new identity and is hiding the fact that she's a vampire. I just happened to pause and catch it right as she was committing the act. They do actually transform while they are consuming their prey, but only for a fraction of a second. Now we just need her to get caught. Maybe we have somebody who can take the fall. And Tosid's got his work cut out for him. Thankfully, this time he didn't feel anything at somebody's death, which is good. No more scary deaths is a good thing. And he's got lots of work to complete. By that I mean plenty of bodies to bury. Get to work, dwarf. These corpses ain't gonna bury themselves. Behind the scenes, when I do have the opportunity to pause, my water wheel system is coming together nicely. And Tosid seems to be in relatively good spirits. He's still one of 2 most upset dwarves in the fort, but at least he's not getting worse. And all he has to say is, it's great when we all get the chance to be merry together. As he's promoting commerce? Tosid, you goddamn capitalist! You really are a vampire. After I put a little bit more time and effort down into the well and the water wheels, It appears that more troglodytes made it into the fortress at some point. I did hear the fighting sounds, but I didn't see anything. They all appear to be dead in the Craftsdwarf's Guild. We'll have to get those cleaned up. Gross. And clearly those troglodytes smelled bad, something fierce. So bad that Tosid had to cleanse his palate with the blood of another dwarf. This one was actually named after someone from chat. Sorry, Anouk. I feel real bad. This was actually like the first couple hours of stream of this fort. So you're the first one down. Congrats. Thankfully, you died well and didn't spook the poor vampire. At this point, he doesn't feel anything when he sees people die. Thankfully, he does have plenty of positive thoughts to go with the negatives. He's very lonely, but at least he likes learning about graving and talking with acquaintances and creating an artifact. The fortress is at the very least somewhat prosperous because, as of fall, more migrants arrive, and they send some very interesting migrants. This doesn't happen very often, but Reg here and his friend Momuz were both caravan guards at one point, along with his wife, Rigoth. Because I retired and reclaimed the fortress, these dwarves were put into the historical figures pool, and thus migrated into the fortress. So now we have some pretty good gear, and some pretty skilled warriors. Reg immediately takes the name Shinobi, and is likely to find some sort of greatness in the world. Welcome to the fortress, dwarf. In fact, I decided he would be fitting as the captain of the guard. You see, he's really good at lying, very greedy, and values the law. I think he would make a perfect corrupt cop, so that I can achieve all of my goals. I need to make sure that Tosid doesn't end up permanently in prison. With my captain of the guard assigned, and an office and bedroom set up, I begin interrogating anybody in the fortress who may have committed a crime. If I can find somebody guilty of a past crime, any kind of crime, perhaps I can pin these murders on them. But without probable cause, I would upset every other dwarf in the fortress who values the law. But right now, aside from the fact that currently I'm having to haul away Tiny Hippo, who was definitely murdered by some sort of vampire, not actually Tosid this time. I mean, we all know who did it, although she's lying about it. Trust me, Tosid obviously keeps up his daily chores and tries his best to act normal. I mean, he does see working hard as a foolish waste of time, so don't ever work too hard. He doesn't particularly value the truth, obviously. He doesn't feel strongly about the law, naturally. He doesn't care about art one way or another, but he dreams of raising a family. I'm not sure how we're gonna go about that, dwarf. Dwarves are gonna be a little bit threatened around you. I'll have to come up with something. And just as I'm pondering such strange existential thoughts, the Free Coven, a rival religion of the god of death, has just requested a temple in the fortress. The exalted blade must be questioned for approval, and he obliges, as he reports the crime of yet another corpse discovered on the ground. A rival religion is likely to cause some tension, but could provide additional scapegoats when a vampire needs a decoy. But for the moment, the best thing that Tosid could do was blend in and not draw attention to himself. And so he picked up a new hobby, whacking rocks with a pickaxe. The dwarves had found quite a large supply of iron in the mountains, alongside of gold and silver. They were going to be rich. This required better defenses, and so the outer bridges were extended. The combination of catapults and bolt throwers would make for some pretty effective defenses. Putting their differences aside, the dwarves needed to get along. There were existential threats of the 100 Years' War with the elves, and the skirmishing with the goblins that they had to contend with, so they had to put their differences aside and work together on all fronts, including building the competitor's temple, the Free Coven. Begrudgingly, Tosid helped with the design and construction of the build. I mean, he's saying it himself. Family is the true bond that keeps society thriving, as he's lonely while being away from family. There's some poetic sadness in that. But as work winds down on the new temple, he goes back to meditating. He's constantly enraptured while performing the rites to his god, and feeling zealous after giving his sermons. All of these positive thoughts are beginning to have a good effect on Tosid. You see, he's no longer the most upset dwarf in the fort, he's now simply in like the yellow kind of middle group. He's still in the lower half of the happiness of the fort, but any kind of improvement is an improvement, and honestly, I'll take it. He's even starting to make some friends, which is a very good sign indeed. And as time goes on, he's gaining more and more happy reoccurring thoughts, which is exactly the outcome we want to see from a dwarf like this. And whenever the general populace is properly distracted, Tosid slips off into the dark passageways that lead to the bedrooms to grab himself a pick-me-up. I'm good, he says, and doesn't feel anything after seeing Ral's dead body. He always reports the crime, and while you might think it's oddly suspicious that he's always stumbling on pawn dwarves that appear completely drained of blood, it is also his job to be the Undertaker, so naturally he would be one of the first to transport dead bodies. Armok willing, he'll be able to get away with it for some time longer. It really makes me wonder, does Shorthast know as well? Shorthast Boatring, of course, the sacred slaughter who I assigned earlier in the fortress, and Tosid's main assistant. She is also having similar sad thoughts that Tosid is having, and is spending most of her time teaching engraving in the Engravers Guild. For the fortress itself, though, it's probably best that I pick up where I left off and continue working on the tombs. We're gonna need some more of these coffins, I bet. And while I have an opportunity because the game is finally paused, I also worked on the outer tower. This is going to double as a barracks and also a guest tavern for temporary visitors. And I've decided that Tosid is going to pick up a new hobby. He's going to learn how to fire a catapult. I would like him to get some training in. And I'll admit, I was a little bit distracted when setting this up, and forgot to dig a little trench in front of this drawbridge here. So when he went to go fire the catapult, it fired a bunch of shrapnel out everywhere, and caused Tosid to sustain some pretty major injuries. He's shaken after suffering a major injury, and experienced trauma. Behind the scenes, another dwarf appears dead, completely drained of blood. Excellent. An alibi. Plausible deniability. After all, Tosid was in the hospital. Somebody else committing crimes draws the attention away from him, and his broken leg. Quickly, the doctors rush to his aid, and the rumblings of a forgotten beast appears off in the distance. It's currently the 2nd, and I won't be able to pause the game until the 5th. Let's really hope that it can't get into the fortress, because I have no way of pulling levers to close the doors. And so 3 agonizing in-game days passed while Tosid got his injuries tended to. And then on the 5th, I paused, and thankfully the beast was down below in a layer where it couldn't access the fortress. It also appeared to be stuck in this tree. It wasn't the most mobile thing, just a pile of grime and filth. Not super threatening. It wouldn't take long for Tosid's wounds to be tended to the point where he could stand up and walk away. He spent a total of 5 days in hospital. Now armed with a crutch and a splint on his upper leg, Tosid gets back to his standard dwarfy affair, and continues to meditate. And I take the opportunity on the 10th to pause and continue working on outside structures. And I check on the water flow of my water wheels, which seem to be up and running and functioning. We'll have a dye industry up and running in no time, and pretty midnight blue clothing. As for Tosid, he was bored after attending a sermon. He wants to give the sermons after all. Shorthast Boatring must not be the best sermon giver. She'll have to work on that. Checking Tosid's reoccurring memories, it does actually appear that he's in a pretty good state at the moment. All things considered, none of his horrified or scared or sad moments have retained in permanent memory, meaning he's not constantly rethinking them. That's good. He's not going to spiral into trauma, at least not yet. And most of his positive memories seem to be sticking, which is a very good thing. He continues to train firing his catapults, except I remembered to put a trench there this time, so the boulders aren't going to break and explode everywhere and hit him with shrapnel, which is a positive. The cycle of catapulting continues for a while, and then I notice some combat logs popping up. Thankfully, it's just the military fending off some coyotes. They must have smelled the cats. The soldiers are actually expanding to be quite the military, and are quite well armed. Granted, they don't have full sets of armor yet, but it is all made of steel. And I'm expecting the population to increase soon, so I'm building out more bedrooms. Don't need any witnesses spotting the vampires, after all. And I decided to set up a military squad down in the cavern layer just to stop this troglodyte incursion problem for good. So they'll now be training in the middle of my gardens here, stopping anything from coming through the gate down there in the lower right. And Tosid opens up the gate so that the dwarves can go outside and collect more wood and other things that we need for charcoal, which will now be defended by that squad. And then he heads back to the tavern, like a good dwarf, having acquired his novice siege operator skill. But after getting yelled at by an unhappy citizen and feeling some enjoyment while performing, he gets an itch and runs just south to consume Dodok, a legendary bone carver, and one of the first crafts dwarves to make an artifact in the fortress. She made an artifact instrument. It was beautiful. Sleep well, Dodok. May your death be painless. Feeling well sated, Tosid moves off to report the crime of yet another found body. The newly appointed captain of the guard, Shinobi, is getting suspicious. Was Tosid involved in these murders? The reality was that Tosid had an alibi. The last murder happened while Tosid was in hospital. Shinobi had confirmed that either there was multiple murderers or Tosid was innocent. This time, the kill affected Tosid, and it's now sitting in his permanent memory. Shaken after suffering a major injury from the recent catapult catastrophe, lonely after dwelling upon being away from family for too long, and afraid after experiencing trauma. As far as which trauma, we don't know, but there's been a lot of it. This is a thought that's going to ricochet around in his mind for a while, and this pushes his mood down, back to the bottom 3. But all of these crimes weren't deterring the new migrants. Dwarves continued to arrive in Aftercasket, and Tosid continued to pray and preach, and the crimes continued to roll in. Tosid was going to need to participate in law enforcement of the fortress if he wanted to survive like this long term. But for now, he was honing a new industry, dyeing, and was learning to dye cloth midnight blue. And as he was honing this new craft, rumble in the deep, the forgotten beast, Pelise, has come, a 3-eyed Quetzal. It has a long, swinging trunk, and it squirms and fidgets. Its goldenrod feathers are downy. Beware its poison sting. But good news, it's the 10th. That means I can keep the game paused and actually assign my military, because it can reach us. This creature is on the same level as the majority of my constructions in the caverns. The good news is it does have a little bit of distance to travel, so without a second thought, I assign my military to gather in the center of my farms, and I let Tosid continue his work. And if I slow this footage down, you'll see the beast enter the bottom gate and immediately get cut into tiny little pieces. The dwarf that got the killing blow took the name of the beast, a hammer dwarf named Volkar, who will now be named Pelise. Congratulations, dwarf. Today you live a hero. After the death of the monster, Tosid decided to acquire a weapon. Just a pickaxe for now, but something is better than nothing. And as he was heading back to continue milling dimple cups, something comes over him. He makes his way up to the surface and pulls the life force out of the veins of the dwarf glass half empty. Erdim. Rest in peace, dwarf. You were always a positive one. And Tosid continues his usual cycle. He reports the crime, and then proceeds to place the body in a tomb. How is he making up all these excuses for these murders? Perhaps he's stating that Urith comes to him in a dream and tells him of a new death in the fortress. Perhaps he's claiming that during his sermons he has premonitions of the future, and Urith tells him when the next dwarf is going to die. There are many excuses he could theoretically be using, but for now, Tosid simply focused on blending in, and I needed more defenses for the cavern layers, just in case more forgotten beasts got in. And outside of the walls of Aftercasket, my military was beginning to explore the hillock sites. You see, we've been at war with the elves down south for many, many years now, and they've destroyed a number of hillocks around the perimeter of our lands, and even captured a dwarven fortress. I'd set a personal goal to recapture this fortress, and one of the better ways to begin training your military to siege any kind of enemy is start exploring abandoned sites. So that's just what we did. This resulted in many artifacts being reacquired, and books transported to the fortress. We'll have to build a library. Reopening those gates to allow the dwarves to collect stuff from outside of my enclosed space in the caverns definitely has its issues, such as this Drothla here, rotting. The sweet smell of rotten flesh. Delightful. As fall draws near, more migrants have arrived, and while wandering into one of his favorite places in the fortress, the Engravers Guild, he feels a twinge in the air. Someone had just been found dead. Obok, the doctor, had been found dead, completely drained of blood. I wonder how this affected Tosid. After all, that was the doctor who applied the splint to his leg and helped provide surgery and clean his wounds. And in reality, it seems that Tosid is hardening. He didn't feel anything after seeing Obok's dead body. Best get him moved to the tomb. And as for Godin, she's continuing to blend in. Tosid suspects, after all, that she may be the other vampire, as she does have a fake name. It's not like she was gone for that long, and she had been here before. As Tosid finished laying the body of Obok in his tomb, Shinobi, ardent worshipper of Urith, member of the Communion of Gods, approached Tosid and said that he would like a word. Tosid obliged and followed him to his office. After a brief discussion, no new information was revealed. Tosid did not let slip that he was in fact a vampire. Now mechanically, this confuses me. If a vampire isn't discovered, and it says no new information was revealed, that is an absolute. It's not possible for them to lie, and also no new information was revealed. However, it isn't appearing in the justice screen that he committed the crimes. So even though he was interrogated by the captain of the guard, the game is insisting that he didn't do it, or no new information was revealed, meaning the kills in his kill count. Mechanically, I think that this simply states that there literally is no new information to reveal. The player already knows that the crime was committed by Tosid. Whereas with Goden, or Stinthad, my adventurer, who's lying about her name, her kills do not appear. So if I were to interrogate her, she would admit to the crime, and new information would be revealed. At least that's how I assume this system works. But for this fortress, for my headcanon, Tosid simply has rock-solid alibis, or very elaborate excuses, as to why he would know that there is deaths happening, but he was not the cause. If Godin takes the fall, Tosid will have to find a way for the kills to continue, or his alibi will dissipate. Once the lengthy discussions are complete, Tosid lets something slip. Perhaps one of the recent recruits to the military should be looked at a little bit closer. And after a quick interrogation, Godin, my adventurer, Stinthad, admitted that her name was in fact an assumed identity, and she'd previously used the name Abby Abby's, or Kulet Abby's, as an alias in the past, and confessed to the murder. While all of this was going on, Tosid was staring at a pile of yet another round of dead troglodytes. Once he was finished planting these seeds, he had his work cut out for him. Time to haul some corpses. And after a secondary investigation, Godin confessed to multiple crimes. It seems that Stinthad, Godin, would take the fall after all. When you're a blood-sucking parasite, it pays to have friends in positions of power or law enforcement. And with that, it was business as usual. Tosid was busy organizing some demolition underneath the front gates, increasing the impenetrable nature of the mountain's slab of aftercasket. This year seems to be looking up for Tosid, because perhaps his curse isn't a curse after all. Perhaps it is a gift from the god of death, to deal death as his god wishes, painless in the night. And if that was the wish of Urdith, then so be it. With the opposing vampire being captured and convicted, this posed a new problem, because Tosid no longer had a reasonable excuse for why the murders were going to continue. And not only that, Godin, aka Stinthad, was going to be in prison for a very, very long time. She had been accused and convicted of 6 counts of murder, which includes 50 hammer strikes at the end of the term, and each term a total of 8 months. A dwarf is unlikely to survive 50 hammer strikes, unless the captain of the guard is exceptionally feeble. Tosid needed an alternative plan, and perhaps he could come up with something. Because things were getting quite busy around Aftercasket. Artifacts were making their way to completion. The dwarves were upgrading the trash disposal, and dangerous were-creatures had begun invading the fortress. Whenever this happened, I would just cross my fingers and hope for the best. And so far, we've been lucky, and no one has been bit. But I always am very careful to check the combat logs. As far as I'm concerned, these soldiers are heroes. But Tosid had a problem. He was getting thirsty, and as he assisted in putting the finishing touches on the new garbage disposal, he needed a drink, desperately, and thus ending the life of another dwarf in the fortress. You can tell he's getting used to this. He no longer feels any emotion at the sight of death. Instead, he simply feels anger while killing somebody. Which means he's getting more positive memories than negative. This is moving him up to the happier end of the mood scale. Good for you, Tosid. After liberating the dwarven soul, he wanders to the tavern to socialize for a bit, when the unexpected comes true. Shinobi, the captain of the guard, wanders in and grabs Tosid by the beard and leads him into the prison. Tosid has been arrested on a technicality. Shinobi learned the truth of Tosid being a vampire, but out of respect for Tosid, he convicted him of a white-collar crime instead of murder. You see, the mayor of Aftercasket has an obsession with crowns. Crowns which need to be created every 3 months. 3 of them at minimum. And selling them is a crime against the fortress. A crime which Tosid had actually committed. While Shinobi knew of Tosid's crimes, he decided to do Tosid a favor. And instead of thousands of days behind bars and hundreds of hammer strikes, Tosid got a conviction of 83 days in prison as a violation of a production order. Tosid didn't mind. He was a little lonely while being confined, but decided to make the most of it and spent the time pretending he was in a tavern, performing. Eventually, other dwarves would join him. Clearly, the time change to the floor helped Tosid in some way, because he learned to accept some of his past trauma and became less angry. And while dwelling upon a past injury, he learned to disdain perseverance. During his prison sentence, the sieges continued, and I constructed a library. Dwarves continued to be nicknamed, and construction requests were completed. But eventually, after a short few days, Tosid was once again released. And with a whisper and a nod from Shinobi, Tosid knew law enforcement would turn a blind eye. and his time behind bars had made him hungry. Tosid was busier than ever. Many unhappy citizens now lived in the fortress. They told him that an Etten had attacked while he was locked up, and due to incompetence, several soldiers died. They also expressed their displeasure with the mayor and the captain of the guard for locking up Tosid. Displeased or not, that's not what the dwarves voted for, and Erish remained as mayor, but rumblings in the deep indicated greater woes. The forgotten beast, Nago King Sodor, has come. A great, hairy earthworm. It has wings of stretched skin, and its fern-green hair is short and even. Beware its webs. Now, I realize that that's just a giant silkworm, but I also realize that it's the 27th of Hematite, meaning I can't pause until the 1st. So all I can really do is let the game run, cross my fingers, and hope that it isn't in an area where it can get into the fortress. And if it is, hopefully it's far away. And unfortunately, neither of my hopes were true. Not only that, but Tosid runs directly into the mouth of the beast, and the body count rapidly climbs. Tosid sprints away in fear of the creature, and thinking quickly, I tell him to take control of a bolt thrower. Unfortunately, I haven't actually set this area up yet, so it can't shoot at anything, but at least it'll keep him in one place. As for the beast, well, it's having a field day, and all I can do is watch as the population drops. As a Hail Mary, I tell Tosid to leave his post and sprint into the fortress. He runs through the battlefield, afraid and vengeful, through the field of detritus and decay, and the beast enters from below, and in a moment of bravery, Tosid turns around and thrusts his pick downwards, destroying the brain of the beast. Knowing he could get away with it, Tosid also took the opportunity to grab a snack. All of this violence had made him thirsty. After a short prayer, Tosid had his work cut out for him, and picked up a crossbow in case something like this were to happen again. It would take a while for the bodies to be cleaned up. The violence had been affecting Tosid in more ways than he'd realized. Sure, he's less angry now, but now he's mulling over the fact that he was locked to the floor with chains for 90 days, and his clothing is rotting, and he was still in need of a new decoy. But fate has a sense of humor, and perhaps he would have that opportunity sooner than he initially anticipated. As they were cleaning up the corpses, an ambush. Curse all friends of nature. The elves from the south were attacking After Casket. Tosid immediately took his position at a bolt thrower and waited for the enemy to approach. It was merely a small raid. There was only about 24 of them. But Tosid had put his next plan into action and had slipped his flask from his bedroom into the militia captain's uniform. It was going to take too long for another decoy to arrive, so Tosid decided to make another one. As the fighting winded down, the dwarves traveled around the perimeter of the fortress, exposing the few remaining ambushes. They fell as quickly as they arrived, and with Tosid's next plan in motion, Tosid decided it was time for another meal. At this time, two things happened. First, they decided it was time to keep the lower cavern layers locked until further notice. Regardless of if it would be effective or not, the fortress needed some more security. And with the fortress growing, they were soon going to need to appoint some higher-ranking officials. Tosid decided to step away from the church and cease being the exalted blade of the fortress. The complaining citizens were taking too much of his time. His time was better used elsewhere, and he applied to become the hammerer of the fortress, which was quickly accepted. Fortress leadership had ordered a full-scale invasion of the elves, which was having mixed results. But frankly, Tosid didn't care one way or another. As long as he had his religion, he would want for nothing. And as he constructed rock coffins at the stonecutters' shops, the fortress bustled forward. Tosid and the captain of the guard were now working in tandem, due to their mutual respect for the god of death. And Shinobi began interrogating exactly who he was directed to, responding to Tosid's beck and call, and many discoveries were exposed. This was good news for Tosid and the religion of death, and even though he was no longer a religious leader, he still practiced what he preached. And the captain of the guard had his back. Tosid was even starting to think that he would get along well in this new role, because when he got lucky, he was permitted to dole out an execution. Dwarves were beginning to take the fall for Tosid's crimes, and all he needed was the new dwarf Cog, militia commander of the fortress, to get a little thirsty, and he would have another rock-solid alibi to put to blame. Tosid's plans were coming together nicely, and the future was looking bright. As Tosid chipped away at the rock coffins, he felt gratitude remembering being rescued. The amount of practice that goes into mastering a skill is so impressive. Perhaps he's referring to the skill of escaping punishment for crimes. But not all would be peaceful. The dwarves had opened up a secondary tavern underneath the external barracks, and the patrons were getting a bit rowdy. Best close the doors. You can't have anybody causing a ruckus in Aftercasket, especially with the invasions and the possessions and the population rising, despite the danger. Tosid was settling into his position in law enforcement nicely, and was looking forward to a promotion to captain of the guard. But not a moment later, the dwarves elected Shinobi as the mayor, putting both the vampire and his loyal servant in charge of Aftercasket. The fortress had just had its first major victory on the front lines. It says that there was a polite discussion with a local rival, but in reality, one of my dwarves wandered in and killed everybody else who could possibly be in charge, and then took the role. In short, we had just captured back a previously elven-occupied dwarven fortress. And without further delay, I send out my messengers to bring back my militia captains. And Tosid felt it was time for a noble sacrifice. Shorast Boatring, the loyal, exalted blade of the communion of gods, was resting, and Tosid felt it was best that she left this world to commune with death, instead of being forced to endure the decay of everything that she knows and loves. And Tosid has truly become used to his position in life. He didn't feel anything after seeing Shorast Boatring die. But honestly, no matter. It was already a day worth celebrating, but doubly so because of Tosid's recent promotion. He is now the captain of the guard, officially. This essentially means he's Judge Dredd. If he decides somebody commits a crime, so be it. And the punishments associated with such crimes are up to him. In fact, he's been enjoying his new job so much that I've intentionally stopped satisfying my nobles' demands, which has pushed Tosid up to the second happiest possible within the fortress. He is now a big smiley on a green smiley face. Just a little bit more, he'll be one of the happiest dwarves living in Aftercasket. Sucks to be the dead ones, I guess. But he's also taken up a bit of a bothersome hobby, reading. Clearly it's permitting him to advise the mayor on fortress design, and he's even admitting it himself. He wants to take his life off and do nothing for the rest of his days. I mean, me too here, Tosid, but retirement in this economy? I mean, come on, man, you're the vampire in the room. You should probably know this better than anybody. Obviously this was proven and he must have been listening, because as I said that, he runs off and proceeds to do something questionable. He's getting more brazen. He drains the blood of Moma's Saber-Honored, who was previously the religious leader of the Free Coven, the rival denomination of Ureth, god of death. And in the room with him, witnessing the murder, waiting for his confessions, was Freeways, the scholar, who immediately reported the crime and screamed how fleeting life is. This doesn't scare me. I'm not sure if I agree with that there, Freeways. I think you're actually quite afraid. And after a quick discussion, a deal is met. Freeways was going to prison and would take the fall, but wouldn't be executed at the end of his punishment. At least, not yet. And Tosid got to work with his favorite part of the job, catching those as they run and chaining them to the floor. Enraptured, remembering the rights of his god, and satisfied after chaining up a creature, he continued to go about his day and pondered his decisions. I find it very interesting that he often will return to the bedrooms of those that he just killed. It's like a serial killer returning to the scene of the crime. It's actually kind of distressing, I'm not gonna lie. Aside from his position in society, not much has changed in Tosid's life. He hangs out in the tavern until someone serves him alcohol. He's just like me, for real. Gets into heated debates, and then he resents it. Same. I'm starting to feel attacked. I think I need a diversion. Thankfully, the game had something in mind. Rumbling in the deep. The forgotten beast. Ngol Gonlith has come. An enormous, one-eyed fantail. It has a twisting, jointed trunk, and it appears to be emaciated. Its gray feathers are downy. Beware its poisonous vapors. In the time that had passed, I'd obviously opened the front door, so it would surely have a way into the fortress. The militias spring into action. The dwarves do their best to evacuate the caverns, but it was too late. The beast had approached rapidly and had already caught several dwarves in their tracks. Blood was being expelled everywhere, and Tosid made the cowardly choice and ran to the surface instead of assisting the dwarves. The soldiers who touched the dust immediately bled to death, but the beast had fallen. Tosid had mixed feelings on abandoning the dwarves, but he must survive at all costs. He accepted the trauma that he was experiencing and pressed forwards as more beasts rumbled in the deep, far enough down that they wouldn't have access to the fortress, at least not for quite some time. With things secure, Tosid needed some alcohol and figured it was time to loiter in the tavern for a while, until a tavern keeper felt generous. At this point, his personality had changed quite considerably. He now truly treasures the company of others, and has an incredibly calm demeanor. He is confident under pressure, and has little interest in joking around, and rarely feels discouraged. He tends to not be swayed by emotional appeals, and is slow to anger, and is not particularly interested in what others think of him, and he prefers that everyone lives as harmoniously as possible, or they will get the hammer, and he doesn't care about anything anymore. 18 kills. Not all of them were dwarves, and not all of them were killed to satiate his hunger, but those that were have become part of him. Tosid has grown in many ways since arriving in Aftercasket. He's become obsessed with his god, and obsessed with preserving his own life, so that he may deal as much death as he can with the time that he has to appease his god. He never really cared about the law. In fact, he barely values it whatsoever, so he's been using his position out of sheer gluttony and greed. The prisons remained full. Trade is the lifeblood of society, utters Tosid. I personally think he's saying that backwards intentionally to mislead, and he truly believes that lifeblood is the trade of a thriving society. At that moment, Stinthad, who refers to herself as Godin, the leatherworker, has been taken by a Fey Mood, the original rival vampire. She was going to create an artifact, and Tosid made the decision to end her sentence early, so that she might create her masterwork. Tosid instructed the dwarves to deconstruct her chain, and it wouldn't take long for her to complete her masterwork artifact, a high boot made from jagged Forgotten Beast leather. She claims it as a personal treasure. If Tosid knew anything, he knew vampires. Having been in prison for so long, Stinthad, Godin, would likely feed many, many times. And Tosid had grown fond of his food supply, and was less inclined to share it. He had even been plotting to send Cog, the militia captain, to her death. And since he no longer needed probable cause, he no longer needed a second vampire to lay the blame on. So he accused her of espionage, and chained her up in the prison, and proceeded to execute her with a silver warhammer. It was a vile, brutal, bloody, unnecessary beating. Tosid cackled in his power, and the other dwarven inmates screamed in fear. After he comes down from his rage, Tosid realizes how easy we are to break. Begone, fear. But still, he was zealous after performing the beating with a hammer. After giving himself a bath and washing the blood off of his body, he convicted the last few crimes that Godin committed. You see, she was so brazen after being released from prison, she ate a dwarf in the middle of one of my barracks, who was lying down taking a nap. The absolute audacity. It was so absurd that it clearly made Tosid hungry. And so he went and consumed a child. And many dwarves witnessed this. But it was too late. There was nothing they could do. Tosid was in charge of the fortress. Judge, jury, and executioner. Undertaker, and resident capitalist vampire. A dwarf that the peasants of Aftercasket had surely begun to fear. And sometimes he would stand over them as they slept, and they could feel it, as if teasing his future prey. Well, that got dark. Oh well. Fall has once again arrived on the calendar, and it's time to trade. But more than that, we have some good news. The Mountain Home has requested that we become official Land of the Realm, and Tosid has an old friend he hasn't spoken about, that he would like to appoint for the position of Baron. Micah has been in the fortress since the first day of its existence, and is one of the founding fathers of the fortress. You could say that he was a bit of a rat. In a dream, Urith came to him before he embarked on this adventure to help form this terrifying place. He knew that someone dark, a prophet, of death would help occupy this fortress and lead it to greatness for the glory of all Urith. Clearly, this is what they needed in order to take over and destroy the elven forces who had stressed them thin. Micah believed this with all of his heart, perhaps against his better judgment, because Tosid did not have Micah's best interests at heart, but did thank Micah for never openly exposing him in the early days before he'd fully gripped power. As a thank you, Tosid offered his approval to Micah becoming a baron, and perhaps even a duke of Aftercasket. Micah was having second thoughts. Was this really what Urith wanted? Perhaps he'd chosen the wrong god at birth, but there was no time to worry anymore. In the previous years, Tosid had honed his combat skills, which of course made him cackle when the pathetic forces of nature tried once again to assault Aftercasket. The one thing you have to give them credit for is they did attack at exactly the right time. One of my squads was in the process of invading one of their tree factories, and Axe was about to leave the map. Instead of turning and fleeing to the edge of the map, he did what any proper dwarf would do, and charged the assaulting forces. He did fall, but not before he made a grand mess of the place. Tosid could smell it, and it made him smile. The dwarves had to act quickly and did their best to scamper back inside of the fortress, retreating to the relative safety of the inner sanctum. Tosid was beginning to question why he protected these creatures. They were simply his food, after all. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the elves seemed a bit reluctant to directly assault the fortress. But eventually, they made their way along the long walkways towards the bolt throwers. This assault brought with them giant flies who were more interested in playing with the puppies. It was as if they put them through a cheese grater and flung them into the abyss. Poor Pooch. The cats were clearly trained in some sort of combat tactics because they were trying to act as bait. I'm not sure how efficient it was. Tosid didn't care. But he did care about the fact that it was taking way too long for these pathetic elves to actually make their way to the fortress. One by one, they would get shot by the bolt throwers, and the rest would simply stand, waiting. It was as if they thought they could defeat the dwarves in hand-to-hand combat. So Tosid decided to take them up on their challenge, and ordered the dwarves charged forwards. Cutting through their ranks like a knife cuts through butter, the elves would fall, and the dwarves would begin patrolling the map, until they found the remaining few lone siegers. Once he ran out of ammunition, Tosid made his way back to the fortress. And he even had a valid reason to leave the fight when he did. Anybody who sticks to something a moment longer than they have to is an idiot. And honestly, he might be onto something there. But he didn't need to fully rearm himself. The elven siege fell shortly after that. So the dwarves made their way back into the fortress and issued direct orders to begin a full assault. In Tosid's mind, he was running the fortress. The Baron was a mayor who he let live, who would soon be appointed as a duke, increasing Tosid's influence. When you have absolute power and no oversight over law enforcement, no one can convict you of a crime. And the dwarves exist to provide him sustenance. And he exists to please Urith with war and death. But that didn't mean that they had to suffer. The fortress continued to expand with more bedrooms and living quarters as the population climbed. Sieges and assaults kept extending further outwards, invading both the goblins and the elves. And the militia captain vampire Cog was lost in combat during a recent siege, giving Tosid complete supremacy over the bloodletting in the fortress. The dwarves were nervous around him, but he didn't get hungry that often. Many of the peasants accepted him as a default leader, but others warily suspected the fortress was on a crash course with calamity. But let's have a look at how Tosid has changed as a person over the past couple of years. In 217, he learned to accept his trauma, which made him less anxious. He learned to accept his brief confinement in prison, which made him more resilient, and he became stronger. When he moved from passive preacher to a religious enforcer, He gained memories of feeling zealous as he delivered beatings, an exhilarating feeling which he felt again and again. I have performed the rites of the communion of gods in this holy place. I am so spiritually proud, he utters as he's working on a rock door. The dwarves around him shudder as the horns sound. An ambush. Curse all friends of nature. The dwarves snap to attention and run to the siege engines. Tosid didn't have time to grab his crossbow, so instead he stands at the bolt throwers. It's odd that the only thing he can dwell on is being lonely after being away from friends for a long time. Perhaps that's because he consumed them. Maybe they'll return as ghosts, and he'll get to see some of them again. Okay, so jokes and dramaticness aside, I have no idea how an elephant stealths, but check this out. So I zoom out going, okay, where are these elves? They're definitely like hanging around underneath the bridge somewhere, and then boom, there they are, right there. Just elephants appearing. Might be one of the greatest visuals of all time. And then they charge, because what else would they do? The elephants assaulted my walls and didn't do much of note, and some of my soldiers decided to charge out to meet them. I think I positioned them in a bad place. The thing about fighting with war animals, or fighting against war animals in Dwarf Fortress, is the animals spook pretty easily, which can very easily break a siege, which seems to be what happened here. And while we did get a few epic moments, I simply told the dwarves to patrol around the perimeter of the map again. It seemed to be the most efficient way of cleaning up the remains. And with that, the dwarves got back to work. I was working on a pump stack at that point, hoping to do something with the lava, but the rate at which I was sieging the goblins was increasing, and it was time to trade, which is distracting. And that brings us to the 8th year of following the vampire. A season has passed, and Tosid's continuing to expand his knowledge, reading all of the books that I keep looting from my constant raiding. He has officially joined the happiest dwarves in the fortress, with the big green smile. When I assigned him as the captain of the guard, I expected him to have nothing but upsetting thoughts, similar to when I followed Cog, but his different personality and general hardness from the overwhelming violence he's caused has made him stunted and unswayed by the fear of death. In fact, the only negative thoughts he gets are the lack of family, who he's estranged from, and the fact that he can no longer eat. And while I tried to help him make friends, he had this pesky habit of sucking them dry, so they never lived very long. Good news is he can always acquire more objects, and our dimple-dye clothing is of extremely high value. And besides, he had plenty of books he could read, and his prison was full, which kept him happy. Every now and again, I had to send him down to the caverns to help kill some forgotten beast. He would always lead the charge and help the beast fall into the abyss. He always enjoyed a good party and spent much time training his individual combat skills in the tavern. Being served alcohol, he watched his subjects babble about, drunk on their own liquor and sitting in their vomit. Disgusting. But Tosid's rule was about to cease being absolute. Somebody with no connection or even a religious commonality with Tosid was about to arrive. The ruler of the dipped volcano had arrived with her full entourage. Our thriving site is now the capital, with continued fortune and toil, a legend of a true mountain home may yet be written. Tosid was disgusted. This so-called queen better bend and bow and follow his every whim, or perish like the others. Queen Zos was an interesting sort. She could get easily caught up in internal deliberation when action was necessary. She had a low sense of self-esteem, was very slow to anger, and had little interest in joking around. Had a noticeable lack of perseverance, and tends to hang on to grievances. She is rarely happy or enthusiastic, and was conflicted by this as she values parties and merrymaking in the abstract. But she is brave in the face of imminent danger. When greeting others, she smiles nervously. Tosid assumed he could overpower this pathetic soul and bend her to his whim. And in the honor of her arrival, Tosid executed a pathetic criminal. Or at least he tried. It was a valiant effort. He simply whacked them once in the arm and bruised them mildly. The command was execute, but he didn't even hit them multiple times. Possibly the most pathetic execution I've ever seen. Anyway, I don't think the queen was impressed. Time to build her throne room, I guess. An appropriate golden throne room was erected, and Tosid spent time in his room, pondering how satisfied he feels about chaining up a creature and trying to decide what to do about this queen. The off-site warfare continued, and the library had expanded to astronomical proportions. The Queen's bedroom was constructed. It needed to be the highest quality. The one benefit of having a queen in the fortress is they have even more demands and requests, which is punishable by beating or chaining if failed to be met, giving Tosid a full-time hobby of kicking the crap out of anybody who did something that he deemed not perfect or to the Queen's expectations. Fall was approaching once more, and it was time to trade, but Tosid wasn't in the best spirits anymore. He dropped down to a yellow blank face. You see, not every dwarf had managed to find their way into a coffin, and the engravers were overworked with all of the death. Ghosts were beginning to return to Aftercasket. Or was it simply the souls he had released coming back to specifically visit him? He began having nightmares and hearing voices. Perhaps the fortress was getting a little bit too crowded, and the population density was starting to get to him. He thought maybe it was just paranoia, so he arrested anyone who looked at him funny, and began detailing walls with etchings of his doings to make sure that the Queen, when she slept in her royal chambers, would know of what would happen to any noble who dares oppose the captain of the guard. And with that, the ruler is satisfied. Deep within the magma sea lies pillars of gems and forgotten metals. Tosid leads the dwarves down into the depths to help mine out some space to begin chipping away at those precious rocks. But he couldn't have picked a worse time. They don't call them forgotten beasts for nothing. I actually forgot about this one. A forgotten beast has entered the fortress. This one breathes fire and is flying, blowing smoke and breathing flame all over the lower levels of the caverns. Hey, look at that! That's melted soap! The soldiers try their best to reach the creature, but can simply do nothing but flail about in the smoke until it enters the staircase, vertically running towards the fortress. And the brave dwarves, with a lucky hit through the smoke and flame, pierce its lungs and hack it in the skull, destroying its brain. But the casualties were catastrophic, and all of the bodies burned. If the fortress wasn't considered haunted before, it surely would be in a minute. Tosid didn't seem to mind, though. He was much more worried about blaming somebody for the disaster and chaining them in the prison. And so he did, before grabbing his sword and shield to go get some exercise. His joints were getting a little bit creaky. When there's ghosts and upset dwarves, there's tantrums. This leads to more crimes being committed. Just mild offenses, such as disorderly conduct, but that doesn't stop Tosid from beating the ever-living life out of them. And come on, man. Ladies in the hospital after having a tantrum. Breaks some stuff, sure. And then he beats her with a sword while she's in hospital, lying down, wounded. Absolutely brutal. All Tosid can say about this is, I could do without all of these creatures and that tangled greenery. There isn't much greenery in this fortress, dude. It's literally a desert wasteland and a mountain that's made of rock. I guess the creatures in this instance are the dwarves. Unless he's talking about the puppies, but I don't think he's that much of a monster. Anyways, I did work on the underground areas. I didn't make a ton of progress, though. The actual lava sea in this map was very, very deep, and I really didn't expect to make it too deep into the adamantine, especially with the recent patches that made digging slower for denser metals. It takes like a minute or two to dig through a single tile of adamantine at a high frame rate, so we were still a ways away from actually getting anywhere in that regard. And the beatings will continue, and frankly, I don't think Tosid cares if the morale improves. And the chaining also continues. There's so many. The ghost of Dwarf Past has returned to speak with Tosid, and says something scary probably, because Tosid is horrified. I wonder what that ghost is telling him, or what it's doing. It certainly ain't no Slimer from Ghostbusters. Tosid is still sucking the life out of dwarves once or twice a year. I wonder if it's like an addiction where the dopamine response gets worse every time you commit such an act, because he doesn't feel anything anymore. He isn't even satisfied after seeing Devil Dawn die. I decided it was time for him to take a break from training because his skills were no longer rusty, with the exception of crossbows, but I wanted him to learn swords. And he's starting to get a lot of very upset moods. He's been dwelling upon his anger, claiming you shouldn't bother to try and play with his emotions. That sounds like a threat, to be honest. And he's horrified of the ghosts. Very least, he still likes his work. It's the one thing he still has going for him. In his reoccurring memories, we can see that he does feel hopeless after suffering the travesty of art defacement. That happened during the fire-breathing beast. A lot of his masterwork clothing was burned. It's a shame, really. Between that and the anger, he's pushed back down into the orange category of upset dwarf. So I decided to give him a break from most of his responsibilities. But a forgotten beast has arrived. Thankfully, it was the 19th when this happened, so I was able to pause and structure the military in time. And 2 of them tantrumed, and 1 of them died due to the tantruming, which is greatly unfortunate. Tosid decided to join them, and once we spotted the beast trying to get in through my water wheels, I told the military to stand on the edge and wait for the creature, except for this dwarf, who's currently missing 2 legs. Tantrums can be tough sometimes. Security, we need a medic down here. It did take a while for this creature to decide to get out of the water. It must have been warm or cozy down there. And just when I was starting to suspect that it wasn't going to actually come and fight us, I told the dwarves to head back into where the water wheels were, and the creature then pops out, and some completely unrelated dwarf managed to stab the beast to death, taking away the honor that Tosid dreamed of so fondly. He wanted to kill another beast. Oh well, back to normalcy for a bit. The fortress was beginning to devolve into absurdity. The tantrums were getting a little bit out of hand, but at the very least, the tavern was still lively, even if there was artifacts and armor and mugs strewn about, and busted up doors. But it seems that the sieges that the dwarves were performing on the goblins were finally starting to have an effect. A vile force of green fists has arrived. They were commanded by a troll named Lena. Beware their mounted goblin lashers. Before they had time to rally the troops, Ast Osanulad has created a diorite sog. It's an artifact. He claims it as a family heirloom. Because I'm assuming you're wondering, it's a large handheld wind instrument, and we shall carry it into battle with glory. If you put a watchful eye on the goblins, you can even see the ghosts watching as the goblins walk by. Were they offering advice, telling them where the entrances are, or simply trying to assist the fortress? I'll never know, but one thing I do know for certain is the goblins' tactics are not the best. Their favorite course of action was to simply charge the gates, to be shredded by bolts and the automatic bolt repeaters. Oh, by the way, at some point we killed a bronze colossus, but it was such an unremarkable battle, I didn't even see it die. I'll be honest, I cut it for runtime reasons. Don't forget to stick around to the end, and if you're still watching somehow and haven't done so yet, maybe subscribe? Where was I? Right, yes, fighting. Tosid made the executive decision to simply lock the doors, because the goblins didn't seem super keen on actually attacking, and it turns out the sense of direction of most goblin battering rams is pretty so 2 orders were given, and 2 levers were pulled. One of them which released some lava to stop the goblins from getting in through the basement, and while they weren't quite there yet, if those giant picks had made it, they definitely would have made it in, and so we set the trolls on fire. It was glorious. The battering ram continued to kind of wander in circles, and the dwarves took a break, and Tosid went back to work, arresting the criminals. This time the bookkeeper, who hadn't been adding enough socks to his personal supply. And the squads refueled on ammo, the gates were reopened, and Tosid held the line until their numbers waned and broke, and he went back to chaining up criminals. The goblins would surely be back, and Tosid knew this. He decided to spend his time praying. The queen wasn't satisfied with his efforts, and was acting strange. The fortress had become too big, the voices had become too loud, and the ghosts that were following him had become too plentiful. He was feeling hopeless, with confused feelings of anger and triumph. He meditated on war, and at that moment, he figured it out. The wars couldn't end, and the dwarves were too powerful. If the fortress continued to grow, and their strength continued to increase, they would defeat all of their foes, and Urith would be displeased. Tosid could never permit such a travesty. So he arrested the bookkeeper again, and set his plans in motion. It is the final year of our adventures with our vampire, and the elves are constantly assaulting the fortress. It's a pathetic attempt to wipe us out, but you gotta give them credit for being ambitious. They caused such a ruckus that this giant bird attacked, and the few stealth elves that I couldn't find were exposed by the birdie. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see it die because while the game was unpaused, I was supposed to be following Tosid, but these migrants sure saw it. The death toll was pretty dramatic, I gotta be honest, but the dwarves made a charge, and Tosid did his best impression of both 300 Spartans and Dynasty warriors, and quite frankly, it was glorious. I rapidly lost count of how many he slay, But because they had been so scattered by the rock and the migrants, they practically assaulted in single file. Tosid got to make a right mess of the place, and I think he enjoyed himself. But the amount of red on the ground is reflected by the amount of red angry faces up in the top left. And yes, he's enjoying this process, but I hate to break it to you. Tosid is one of the red faces. This whole event was very traumatic for him, and the only respite that he got in the fortress was him arresting people a bit. See what I did there? Out of fear of him losing his mind completely, I started dealing with the ghost problem. Even though I found it fit with the aesthetics of the fortress, it turns out that no matter how cool they can be sometimes, dwarves just don't like being around ghosts. That became extremely clear when a ghost possessed one of my dwarves into a brawling tantrum who killed the mayor. And thus, Handchest was elected. And after murdering the mayor, that same dwarf then walked into the nearby temple, and as you can see, he broke one of the doors, which got him cursed as a vampire. The more the merrier, I guess? It's a shame that I had to go back to following Tosid, because that new vampire then proceeded to kill the queen, moving the line of succession to Maffle. It's actually kind of amazing. You can see this little streak of red in the throne room. Death marks the spot, I suppose. And the new queen also happens to reside in the fortress. Better get the last one buried, and I will double up the tombs for the next one. Welcome to the fortress, Queen number 2 Electric Boogaloo. And as for the Queen Slayer, I don't really know what to do with him. Full disclosure here, I did not expect to have more than one vampire in the entirety of this fortress, because when I started it, there was only one living dwarf in the world who was a part of this faction who also happened to be a vampire. That's Dwarf Fortress for you. Never fails to be exciting. Toasted was too busy not feeling anything anymore to actually really care or even seemingly notice the other vampire. He was just off training and chaining. I don't know why he keeps chaining up the bookkeeper. It's literally the only person that's getting convicted of crimes. Why are people dying? That's probably not good. Actually, it was fine. One of them was a dwarf who starved to death a while ago after going insane, and the other one was the queen. That clicking sound spooked me. I would also like to take a moment to note that dwarves do in fact use their armor stands. You just have to make sure that you don't have stockpiles that are assigned to use that type of armor. I usually just put it as a quality setting. Steel armor and gear of masterwork quality doesn't get put into stockpiles. So when the dwarves equip it, which they naturally will, they then leave it on armor stands. It's pretty nifty, as Tosid does here. I had Tosid keeping busy, burying a lot of corpses, although I do have to admit that I did expand the Undertaker crew, but that's mostly because when Shorthass Boatring died, I then later appointed new religious leaders for that faction, and then kind of just expanded it to any religious leader in the fortress. And there was 3 different temples at this point. The kill count was getting, quite frankly, impressive, or staggering, and I was doing my damnedest to start World War Dwarf by invading every single goblin site that I could get my grubby little axe in. I was also trying to get down to the underworld, but unfortunately, that didn't end up paying off. And as Tosid feels like Captain Disillusion, suffering the travesty of art defacement, a vile force of darkness has arrived. The army is commanded by the Monera. Go! Youth Strike. Youth Strike has to be the name of some hardcore punk band from the 90s. And if you're wondering what the heck a Monera is, they're these little guys. They got funny faces, and are mostly just a head with arms and legs. Funny little fellas, to be honest. The same siege also brought cave dragons, which are mostly scary because of how fast they move, and the fact that they can destroy doors. But Tosid snapped. He didn't even care about the siege. I enabled the bolt throwers, but he simply ignored the orders. He was too busy arresting people once again. The first order I was able to get him to follow was pulling the lever to lock the door, and with that, he went back to meditating. In my mind, this was it. Tosid had snapped. He was going to bring down the fortress. It was what he wanted. All of the noise was getting to be too much for him. Perhaps vampires are not meant to live within Dwarven society. They will inevitably self-isolate and separate themselves from those who can still breathe. The goblins slowly built structures underneath the front gates, chipping away at the bottoms of the stairs, and the queen barred her door, and after meditating on war, until his mind calmed, Tosid gave that lever one final pull. This opened the gate, providing the goblins with entry to the fortress. Seemingly they would have gotten there eventually, at least if the battering ram actually made it to the front door. It was just kind of pacing back and forth, seemingly useless. They really need to work on the pathing of those things. And the massacre began. Jabberers, goblins, trolls, and Moneras, fighting their way through a horde of livestock, and Tosid began to sharpen his blade. and then made his charge, hacking throats and cutting necks in a flurry of gore. But of course he had to stop because he thought for a second, maybe I will go chain up Meng. And amazingly, he made it down to Meng's bedroom. Tosid dragged his would-be criminal through the field of tunnel muffins, and as he walks, he cuts down goblins, determined to complete his arrest. But he must have forgotten a step, like his keys or something, because the second he finished chaining up Meng, Meng just booked it. Perhaps his sentence was already complete, and he chained the creature and then immediately unchained him? I don't know. He couldn't find a hammer, so no beating was completed. Probably saved Meng's life. As he walked back upstairs, something twitched in his brain once more. He had to chain up the bookkeeper. There is no way he could permit such a horrendous criminal to remain free, and actually correctly chained her up, and then went back to cutting up goblins, and beak dogs, and more goblins. Do you ever get the feeling that you need to unironically shout, "You shall not pass"? Because that's the vibe this is giving me. Tosid moves back up to the main lair and continues to cut the beak dogs before finally moving towards the front door, passing by the mounds of dead. He doesn't feel anything. As he reaches the corner of the bridges, he freezes, and his life flashes before his eyes. Had he made the right decisions? Was death truly the answer? Was the endless war the best he could have done? Could he have killed more? And could he have murdered better? Urith gave him the gift of death, and in some ways, he felt that he had squandered it. No matter. There was more things that needed to die. His body was invincible, and there was no way that he could fall. Tosid was immortal, all-powerful. Guilt Monk, the smooth plane of floors, shall never die. So I got a level with you. We didn't actually survive a complete 10 years. It was actually 9 years and 11 months. But the ending here just seemed too fitting, and so I had to run with it. After Tosid passed, the goblins swarmed the fortress and slaughtered everything that remained. Some of the dwarves who'd done time in the prisons made a valiant attempt to hold their ground, but the goblins pushed forwards. The watchful ghosts gazed out into the hallways, happy that their friends were soon going to join them. This place was cursed with the vile forces of Urith, because unknown to the dwarves, the reason these goblins exist, their mortal enemies, who they do eternal war with, is worshipped by many goblins. The dwarves had been played into a trap of their own creation. They could have found relative peace, hiding in their mountain homes, but instead they chose invasion, and the goblins brought with them death. Eventually, the halls of violence quieted down as the last of the goblins fell. And that stupid battering ram that never made its way to the front door was cut by Dastot. The remaining 12 dwarves huddled in the hospital, tending to the wounds of the few wounded dwarves who had yet to perish, and the queen unbarred her door and had her final meal in the capital of Aftercasket. Amongst the living was Micah, the Duke, who somehow, against all odds, survived in the fortress from the very beginning until the final days. And as he pondered through his thoughts, the memories, and how they affected him, he let out a long breath and swore allegiance to the god of death, Urith. Will the war-torn dwarves of Aftercasket survive the journey to the nearest place of refuge? Will Micah continue his reign as a duke in the cursed faction of the dipped volcano? I don't know, because that is a story for another day. This is sort of a spiritual successor, as I mentioned back at the beginning, to a fortress where I followed Cog for 10 years. The amount of times I had to re-record lines because I just fell back into saying everything was named Cog really made me realize that I missed an opportunity to simply name this dwarf Cog as well and keep a through line there. A universe of cogs, if you will. Like they're all cogs in the machine. Thankfully, we did have a Cog for a bit, although she kind of died unremarkably off map, which I was a little bit bummed about. If you like this video, you may notice that this video doesn't have any sponsored segments. I rely solely on YouTube advertising. And if you enjoyed this video and you would like to see it continue, perhaps you could stop by one of my Twitch streams at twitch.tv/BLINDIRL. Or alternatively, you could support this video financially via my website. Until the last day in March, if you use the code MARCH, you could get a 50% discount off of your first month of my recommended tier. And even if you don't watch the live streams, you'll get previews for videos like this one, sent directly into your email. And either way, if you could leave a comment on this video, that would be extremely helpful. I realize I'm now the one asking for assistance here, and perhaps that makes me a bit of a blood-sucking vampire. Honestly, it probably suits me. This has been a fun villain era, and I will see you in the next one.